I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
Anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah initiative, conversation without compromise.
So I'm actually really excited about this because the circumstances this came about were bizarre.
Right.
So last Monday, I got back from vacation Sunday, and I decided on Monday the next episode we need to put out is one on Kurdistan.
Right.
And I didn't know where to meet Kurds in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's a huge population.
It's not in Seattle. In Portland and Vancouver, Canada, there is.
So the next day, on Tuesday, I'm in this Turkish coffee shop of all places, right? I mean, right now that's kind of ironic,
right?
And the child smiles at me, and I approach the child's mother and say, "Oh, how old is he?" And one, "Oh, great, I have a child about the same age." And I ask, "Oh, what's his name? Is it Apo?"
Yeah, Apo.
Yeah. And then it's like, Apo. I was like, "Oh, great, where's that from? The Middle East? Oh, where?" And then like Kurdistan. Haha, perfect.
That's funny too, and it's at a Turkish coffee shop, and his name is Apo.
yeah. So the timing of it is pretty spectacular. So I'm really glad we've got.
No, yeah, she texted me your card, and she's like, "Yeah, reach out to him," and yeah, that's why I emailed you right away. So, but I apologize. It's been so hectic. I've been doing other interviews and stuff and publishing articles and stuff, but it's been hectic since the start of the war. So,
right. So, tell me a little bit about yourself and your story and what you do now.
Right. So, I'm Kurdish myself. I'm from Kirkuk, Iraqi Kurdistan. And my family and I fled during the first Gulf War. We fled Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the Ba'athist regime. After he shifted and turned towards the Kurds, towards the north, we ended up fleeing Iraqi Kurdistan and basically fled to Iran. We were rejected there. We fled to Turkey. We were rejected there and ended up in Syria. So my family and I, we lived in a Syrian refugee camp for 7 years in the 90s. And it's a United Nations refugee camp, which is still operational today. It's called Al-Hol Camp. And Al-Hol is today it's housing, I believe, about 80,000 IDPs and refugees, which includes thousands and thousands of ISIS wives and children as well. So it's crazy. It's the same refugee camp that we were in Syria, near the Iraqi border, still occupation. It's operational today. But after 7 years, my family and I, we came to the United States. And have been living in, my family has been living in Seattle, Washington ever since. And I ended up I did my bachelor's at University of Washington in politics, philosophy, and economics, but decided to pursue my master's degree and moved to DC here about 3 years ago now. And so I did an international peace and conflict resolution at American University. Since I've been in DC, I've been working on Capitol Hill, advocating, educating on giving the congressional staffers and congressional members, both the House and the Senate, just educating them on the plight of the Kurds. I've been writing articles ever since I moved here, and now I'm the director of external relations at a private firm called Allegiance Strategies, continuing to work on different issues such as the Kurds, minorities, Yazidis, religious freedom, and different aspects of those.
Okay, great. So give us some back for those listening who don't know the story of the Kurds as a people group. When in history does that come into play, and what's the backstory leading up to this moment?
Right. So the Kurdish people, they're indigenous peoples of the Middle East. Today they number about 45 million, estimated 45 million, give or take. They live in northern Iraq, northwest Iran, southeast Turkey, and northeast Syria, and in what they call Kurdistan. So the Kurds were promised a state of their own, but weren't given their state of their own after the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the World War I. And today they still continue to pursue self-determination. And the Kurds feel they've been betrayed, and as you know, they're the largest ethnic group without a state to this day. So after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed with the creation of the Turkish state in 1923. The Kurds were, from after World War I to today, were lacking basic human rights in the states that they preside. For example, in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, they continue to be bombed and bombarded, the cities razed to the ground. Saddam Hussein led an foul campaign, a genocide campaign against the Kurds, used chemical weapons. That's when my family was affected as well, when we fled. The Kurds in Syria, since the Assad regime, even his father, Hafez Assad, was in power, they were considered stateless peoples. They weren't given citizenship, for example. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to name their children's names, Kurdish names. And they weren't allowed to have an education and be part of the society or have adequate jobs like other Syrians. So they had absolutely no right up until 2013, a couple of years after the civil war, 2011. Same story with the Kurds in Turkey since 1923. Up until, say, about 1979 to 1984, the Kurds were, and even to today, the Kurds were considered mountain Turks. So the identity of the Kurds was not recognized. Turkey led a campaign of Turkishness, basically, if you will, saying that whoever decides that they're not Turks, they're not considered human beings, they're not considered part of the society, and they will be targeted. And it's been the same idea within Turkey, which is causing Erdogan to lead this war against the Kurds in Syria. The Kurds were continued to be stateless from 1923 to 1984 and up until now. The reason why I say 1984 is because from 1923 to 1979 was the creation of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party inside Turkey. And there's about 25 million Kurds in Turkey alone. Keep that in mind. And the PKK was created after the continuous destruction of the Kurdish identity, from language to their history, to their dress, to their even music, to their names, to their politicians. So the Kurds tried the political route. Even today, they try the political route, but they continue to be jailed. They continue to be labeled as terrorists on absurd charges. Many Kurdish politicians and human rights activists and lawyers, human rights lawyers, are in jail and in prison largely because they're Kurdish, largely because they speak up against an invasion that Erdogan is leading. And it's the same story across Kurdistan. And same thing with Iran, which has 12 million Kurds on its own. And actually the first Kurdish state started in Iran, in northwest Iran, was called in 1946. It was called the Republic of Mahabad. Of course, that was quickly squashed by the regime, by Tehran, after the Soviets withdrew from the northern regions of Iran.
So, why is it you think that the regimes the Kurds live under have this universal reaction of trying to stamp out that identity and try and erase the identity there?
Right. So largely because the Kurds pursue self-determination. The Kurds feel that as part of being part of the Middle East, they also have a right to their own state, just as the Turks do, just as the Iranians do, and just as the many Arab states have. You know, many times a lot of people pursue the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, and pushing for a Palestinian state, but the Kurds are largely being ignored. And the areas that the Kurds are not a small population. I said they're about 40. There's about 5.5 million alone in Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan. You know, there's 3.5 million in Syria and Kurdistan. It's 12 million and 25 million. The central governments have to calculate certain aspects of this issue. So, you know, are they going to give up territory? We saw this with the Iraqi Kurdistan referendum, which you know, the surrounding states in 2017, the surrounding states rose up, allied, even though they disagree on many issues, but they became a large, strong alliance against the Kurds. They surrounded the Kurds, they closed the airspace down, largely because this means that they're going to take territory away. This means that the Kurds are going to take a large portion of the population away. This means that the Kurds have a very resourceful, rich territory. Includes gas, oil, access to the rivers, the Euphrates River, for example, agricultural dams and agricultural fields. So the areas that the Kurds live in is also resource rich too. And also, this will break up the Middle East. This will shake the Middle East if a Kurdistan is created in the lens and the perspective of these central governments. Because the Kurds compromise over 4 states. That means 4 states will be changed. The geography will be changed. And a new state will be created right in the heart of the Middle East. And also, you have to think about the larger perspective, the Israeli issue in the Arab world and in the Middle East. The Israelis see that a Kurdish state is a benefit to their existence, largely because they don't have many allies, and the Kurds are softer on the Israeli issue than the rest of the region are. And even though the Kurds are Muslim, about 90% of the Kurds are Sunni Muslim.
And I guess you've got the thing where the idea of even thinking in nation states isn't a hugely popular idea in the Arab world to begin with. So when people actually set a declared state, it's sort of further cementing the world into this Westphalian nationalism and Atlantic Charter, where people have the right to determine their own futures, and that's a threat to kingdoms.
Right, exactly. And I would add that self-determination and a state of their own for the Kurds is the only realistic mechanism in which they can have long-term security, have international laws applied to them, prevent incursions and military interventions. I mean, look at the Jews, right, in the Middle East. Look at the Armenians since the 1915 genocide, Ottoman genocide against them. I think largely because Kurds are considered non-state actors. They're not recognized internationally. They don't have a seat at the UN. They're not invited to, for example, peace talks. Syrian civil war has started since 2011. There's been countless Geneva peace conferences, and the Kurds, huge actors in this whole conflict, control not 30% of Syrian territory, a third of territory, and they're not invited to the peace talks, for example. So a state would give them that. A state would allow them to prevent border incursions, such as Turkey coming into West Kurdistan, for example, or Rojava, the Syrian Kurds, or having their territories be economically deprived, largely because the government thinks it's the right thing to do, and these guys are terrorists. But in reality, these guys are the Kurdish population is simply seeking their basic rights, such as just to speak their language, their mother tongue, which is considered illegal in Turkey in some cases.
So a little bit more background here. So obviously the Kurds have come into far more prominence in Western eyes with the advent of ISIS, and really they've been on the front lines of pushing back ISIS as far as on a Syrian level. I mean, much more so than the government forces, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Kurds, so Iraqi Kurds, the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. We saw with the rise of ISIS in 2014, they went into Raqqa, into Syria, and when they came into Mosul, for example, in Iraqi regions, it was the Kurds that pushed back ISIS. When the Iraqi military forces fled, and Kirkuk was the Kurds that, they were nearing Kirkuk, Kirkuk, my hometown, and it was the Kurds that came in and took control of that territory where there was a vacuum to be filled. If that vacuum wasn't filled by the Kurdish military forces, it would be filled by ISIS today. Same thing in Syria, in northeast Syria. The Americans and the international community were looking for an ally. They tried the Free Syrian Army to fight the Assad regime that failed, and then when ISIS rose in 2014, they were still lacking a strong, united force that can face ISIS on the ground. And the Free Syrian Army was divided into many factions. Many of them were designated terror organizations by the U.S. Many of them were affiliated with Al-Qaeda groups. But the Kurds were able to form a united front. The Kurds are known to be great fighters, fierce fighters on the ground. And the Kurds did something very unique that the other coalitions did not. The other groups did not. They included both ethnic and religious minorities of northeast Syria. So it wasn't what we call today the Syrian Democratic Forces. It wasn't just the Kurds that were fighting in the front lines. It was also Arabs, there was Armenians, there was Syriacs, there was Assyrians, it was all the indigenous Muslims, Arabs, it was all the indigenous Syrian population. Yes, it composed a majority Kurds, but this is what the international coalition was looking to do, and it was successful. That's why this incursion is a betrayal in the eyes of the Kurds. With the allowing Turkey to come in and invade as it wants, taking 30% of territory, it's just not what the Kurds expected from the United States.
So, right before we get to that,
yeah.
So post ISIS, let's talk about the lay of the map for the Kurds in the Middle East. So we've got it seems like the closest, the best place for the Kurds and self-determination right now would probably be Iraq, right?
Today, I mean, it was prior to the 2017 referendum, yes, but because they took that step. Like all Kurds, I'm for independent Kurdistan. I, fully support self-determination. But in my opinion, the 2017 referendum largely failed because of internal issues the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, had at that time, and which they still do. So yes, the answer is that the KRG Iraqi Kurds are the closest to gaining self-determination. But at the same time, they've taken 10 steps back with that referendum that they went with in 2017.
And then before the invasion, what was the position of the Kurds in northern Syria? What was the hope there?
Right. So before the invasion of this invasion, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So the hope was to continue the self-governing territory that they have carved out. Which includes 30% of Syrian territory. They don't want a state of their own. That's very important. Many critics will tell you that they're trying to carve out their own state. No, they want to stay within the borders of Syria, but through a decentralized system. That means delegitimizing the Assad regime, going away from Damascus, and allowing the population of northeast Syria to govern themselves. Because the alternative is back to the Assad regime. The alternative is going with the Ba'athist regime that was governing Syria since the 70s. So their hope was to continue this self-governing system that they created since 2015, east of the Euphrates River, which is 30% territory, holds about 80 to 90% of Syrian resources, which empowers women. Which empowers ethnic and religious minorities. Remember, the civil war is continuing. Turkish threats are coming from the north. Many factions, Shiite militias, Russian mercenaries, Assad forces, for example, are continuing to threaten this territory, while ISIS may be defeated as far as the caliphate. At that time it wasn't, but now it may be defeated, but there are still an estimated 20,000 fighters across Syria and Iraq. They created this a very, to a certain degree, very stable territory region for themselves in northeast Syria. And now this is being threatened by Turkey's Erdogan. And it was largely successful, yes, because of the global coalition, which included the United States and 80 members.
Right. So the United States is backing the Kurds through a joint coalition. ISIS is defeated. Everything's looking promising. And then Trump snaps the Infinity Gauntlet and then tell us what happened immediately after.
Right. So everything was going great. This goes back to, of course, President Trump wants to please his base. Of course, President Trump wants to end these so-called endless wars. But President Trump and U.S. officials have to understand that U.S. presence in the Middle East is very symbolic and it's very impactful. Their presence can stabilize an entire region, and we saw that in northeast Syria with as little as 2,000 troops before December 2018, and just about a week and a half ago, since before the incursion, with as little as 1,000 troops. So their presence is very huge and symbolic and very important. This incursion that Turkey took upon was a green light from President Trump, unfortunately. But this began in December 2018. President Trump received a similar call in December 2018 from Erdogan. And after a call, he announced, I think it was via Twitter, that he wants to withdraw troops from Syria. Of course, he ended up taking that back in December. I think started about February, March, April. But he decided to go with a gradual withdrawal instead of an immediate withdrawal, which was better than fully withdrawing, because we knew the realities of the region. If the United States just withdraw from that region, this will give Iran, the Assad regime, Hezbollah forces, Shiite militias, Russian mercenaries, and Russian forces access to these resources. It will legitimize the Assad regime further by giving him more territories. U.S. presence in the region also was very symbolic because it kept a NATO ally away that threatened our other ally, which happens to be the Kurds. So all the United States had to do was put a few hundred forces along the Turkey's northern border, Syria's northern border, and put up some flags and troops, and that was an agreement. Before this incursion, the Americans and the Turks did agree on a security mechanism, which included Turkish forces coming into northern Syria, about 3 kilometers into northern Syria, patrolling with U.S. forces. So this was definitely agreed upon. This mechanism worked. This fulfilled Turkey's so-called security concerns that they have towards the Kurds. So everything was fine. But after another call, I believe it was on the 6th of October, it was a Sunday night, I remember it was about 11 p.m. The news broke out that President Erdogan just spoke to President Trump, and now he agrees to a so-called safe zone into northeast Syria. The problem with the safe zone is, the Kurdish argument is simply, if we're a legitimate security concern to Turkey, if Turkey feels that we are a threat, they can create a 100-mile safe zone, but have it inside Turkey. Why does Turkish forces have to be inside sovereign Syrian territory, right? We understand Turkey's foreign policy. We understand Turkey's aggression campaign against the Kurds within Turkey, and we know this will reflect on the Kurds in Syria. We also saw what the Turks and Erdogan did in Afrin from another invasion in northwest Syria that they did in 2018. It was a 3-month campaign called Operation Olive Branch in northwest Syria. And it was a predominantly Kurdish region. It was about 95% Kurdish. What Turkey did there in a small portion of northwest Syria in the Kurdish region, he wants to do on a larger scale in northeast Syria. And that was Turkification of that territory. That was Islamization of that territory. Al-Qaeda affiliates are all over that region now. Kurds were forced to flee their homes. He created demographic change. He brought in buses and buses of Arab Syrian refugees that were taking refuge inside Turkey and put them in Afrin, and which they don't even belong there. An interesting fact is that what Erdogan wants to do in northeast Syria with this so-called safe zone, he wants to bring in Syrian refugees that are taking refuge inside Turkey and put them in these Kurdish regions. But the problem is 85% of these Syrian refugees inside Turkey are not from northeast Syria. They're from west of the Euphrates, so they don't belong there. So yes, Syrian refugees should go back to their home, but that comes at the risk of demographic change and ethnic cleansing the Kurds, pushing out the Kurds and putting them. And that's what Erdogan wants. As long as there's no dominant Kurdish force on the ground, as long as there's no self-governing system for the Kurds on the ground, he's more than happy to allow these Arabs come in and take over the Syrian Kurdish territories.
So thinking about Erdogan here, I guess my understanding of what's happening is how the justification being used for this is Turkey itself is made of about 80 different ethnic minorities,
right?
I believe, and the fear it has been if one minority leaves, then that's just one thread out of the sweater that ends up pulling everything apart. And I think so then I think what happens is because the Workers' Party in Turkey has perpetrated some things that are probably less than above board,
right?
Then that's used as a justification for conflating the Workers' Party in Turkey with the Kurds in a general sense.
So yes, to a certain degree, yes. So Turkey fears that if he allows the northeast Syria to be a autonomous region, for example, to be decentralized away from Damascus and allow them to continue to govern themselves as they've been successfully, this will create a domino effect because the Kurds in Syria have a close relationship with the Kurds in Turkey. And he also fears that, and that's why Erdogan was very outspoken against the Iraqi Kurdish referendum in 2017, which Erdogan also sees them as an ally. So you have to ask yourself, if you're a Kurd, Erdogan is against all Kurds, right? Because Iraqi Kurds, they have very strong economic ties with Ankara. They have, the Iraqi Kurds sell oil independently through Turkey, through Turkish ports. And I believe Turkey is the second exporter of, the Kurds are the second largest exporter with Turkey. So this is not, for Erdogan, this is not a question of, we're going after terrorists, we're going after the PKK, they're a threat, and we have legitimate security concerns. No. Why was Turkey doing this? And I always bring this up. I don't believe that this is a Erdogan problem. I think this is a Turkish problem. Turkey has a Kurdish question that it does not want to solve through peaceful means, because we have to ask, where was the PKK before 1979, right? There was no PKK. So between 1923 and 1979, and then 1984, when the PKK finally took up arms, what happened in between those years? Something had to happen for the PKK to evolve. Something had to happen for the PKK to take up arms, right? Something pissed the Kurds off. That was because the Turkish state has always been against the Kurdish identity. That's from any government, because the Turkish state was founded upon nationalism. The Turkish state was founded upon. I read a book. I'm reading a book, and it says that Hitler's role model was Ataturk. That should tell you something. Turkish state is based on fascism. The foundation of the state is based on how Turkish you are. And when the Kurds, because they are proud Kurds, because they want to speak their mother tongue, because they want to sing in their own language and don't identify as Turks, they're not called Kurds anymore. They're called Mountain Turks. And the state attacks them. Now Erdogan is taking this another step further. He's calling everybody terrorists, even outside of the Turkish borders, and that happens to be the Syrian Kurds, because they're next, because they happen to create a self-autonomous region, and he fears that it'll create a domino effect, and that the Kurds in Turkey will rise up, and those Kurds are next to basically call for an autonomous region of their own.
So, from your perspective, what is your general hope for the Kurds for the future at this point? Is it a nation? Is it autonomous regions within the nations they're in? And realistically, what is the roadmap towards that?
Right. So realistically, I think the goal should always be self-determination. I think realistically, there's no reason, it is a right of the Kurds for them to have a state. As far as taking steps towards that, of course, autonomous is the first step, being autonomous and governing your own territories, having a say within your own territories, and without interventions from the central state. And that's what the Kurds in Syria were trying to do. And that's what the Kurds in Iraq achieved after a implementation of a no-fly zone from the United States, and with the creation of the Kurdistan Regional Government in 1992. And the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan, we say they're the closest to independence, largely because they've been able to govern themselves. And it's been the most peaceful and stable part of Iraq. And even from the 2003 Iraq War, not one American life lost their lives in Iraqi Kurdistan. They went there to seek, to vacation, actually. And so the Kurds in Syria created the same similar stabilizing territory in northeast Syria. It was because the Kurds led this. All Kurds want is to be able to have a say in their own future. And I think they have a right to this. And I think the continuous goal of the Kurds, if they want long-term security, it should be self-determination. And that may be in the form of autonomous regions, and that may be in the form of a state that we call Kurdistan. That's up to the people on the ground. But I think as long as the Kurds are isolated, and as long as the Kurds are not considered actors in the international community, they will continue to, because there's nothing to protect them. They don't have an air force. They will continue. There's no laws don't apply to Kurds, whether we like it or not. However many international laws we want to apply and read, they may sound nice on paper, but laws clearly don't apply to the Kurds. We saw this after the referendum. We saw this after the incursion of Kirkuk with Shiite militias. We saw this with countless of betrayals on the U.S.'s part. We are seeing this with this incursion from Turkey. Turkey is using chemical weapons, phosphorus, and the international community is quiet. Turkey is aligning itself with Al-Qaeda forces. The international community knows this. NATO knows this, but they're not saying anything. Turkey is clearly, in broad daylight, is invading a peaceful territory in a small part of Syria. Everybody knows it's wrong. Everybody knows it's not the right thing to do. Everybody knows it was the Kurds who led the fight in the end of the caliphate. And the international community is doing this. Why? Because they can do that. Why? Because Turkey can do this. And because international laws don't apply to the Kurds. It just simply doesn't. And I think once you achieve self-determination and you have a border, these laws will apply, because then Turkey will be, if it continues to behave the same way, then Turkey will be invading a country, not just some people, not just some territory, and not just security concerns.
Right. So obviously the self-determination was probably the biggest piece in the post-Second World War world. Do you think there's a reason people have forgotten that doesn't seem to be a priority for people anymore?
I think largely, globalization has taken hold. We are more connected than ever before. And that we see that, we try to push, and this kind of undermines minorities. That's the whole issue of this. is, yes, those people who are speaking of, no, we no longer need, states and self-determination, are the people that have states.
Yeah.
But the people who don't have states are like, hey, what about us? Okay, you guys are moving on, but we haven't even had that peace. We haven't been part of that history, right? We haven't been able to determine our own future and our own fate. What about us? So, and that's why self-determination is a very important and critical aspect that those who have self-determination should allow those who don't have it and who haven't been able to achieve it yet, should empower those people to gain it. Partially because it's for security. If we're for the stabilization of a region, I think a state of their own, whoever it might be minorities, Christian minorities, Assyrian. I mean, I've had conversations with Assyrians saying they want a state of their own, or that same idea is, why don't we move beyond this, this idea of statehood and, drawing borders? Why is it, my question for, my response is always, why is it okay to have 22 Arab states? Why is it okay for Turkey to have a state? Why is it okay for Iran to have a state? Why can't the Kurds? Why are we pushing so hard for a Palestinian state, right? They have a right to a state. Why can't the Kurds? Why is it taboo for the Kurds to have a state of their own? We're Muslims. We're part of the Middle East. Genocide has been inflicted upon us. We're constantly being invaded. We have a large population. We have a military, right? We have a constitution. We have a flag. We have everything that you need to have a state. But why do we have to move outside of the scope of this nation state idea when it comes to the Kurds, but it's okay for everyone else? So I think that the Kurds, I'm largely for the self-determination of the Kurds, and I think it would be a mistake for Kurds to let this idea go, because I mean, we see and these central governments are proving us wrong every day, right? How can we be part of a state that's called Turkey when Turkey doesn't recognize us as Kurds? We're Kurds, we're not Turkey. The population of Turkey is not 79 million, it's not 80 million. 25 million of those are Kurds, but Turkey will never tell you that. And same thing with these other governments.
I wonder if part of what has happened here is you have this, whatever the real reasons for the most recent Iraq war were. I think that what you saw in American culture was this unbridled idealism of, you go in, you get rid of the bad man, and everything kind of fixes itself. It'll be amazing. And I wonder if that's one end of the pendulum, and it's kind of swung back now to this cold, hard pragmatism that isn't driven by ideals at all, and it just keeps swinging from one way or the other, and they're not closely tied together.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. Americans don't have an appetite for wars. Americans, rightly so. Americans don't have an appetite for endless wars. And this is a part of that. This reaction we're getting with President Trump is part of it. But you also have to understand what happened in Northeast Syria. It was very, very unique. It was not like the 2003 Iraq War. What happened in Northeast Syria is that the U.S. invested very little U.S. burden, but gained so much more. With 1,000 troops, you were able to push back a NATO ally from attacking another ally. You were able to push back another major world power, Russia. You were able to delegitimize Assad regime from gaining more territory. You were able to control 90% of Syrian territory because Assad, the regime is broke. The Iranian regime is shattered with sanctions. Russia is broke. Its economy is not doing very well because it spent so much money in Syria as well. So you were able to do so much with very little. And the major role of U.S. forces on the ground in Northeast Syria was to advise, to equip, to train, and at the very end, just up until about a week and a half ago, to patrol the northern border. That's about it. It was the Kurds and their Arab allies and the Syrian Democratic Forces that defeated the caliphate, along with global coalition airstrikes. but they were on the ground. It was the Kurds that had 11,000 fighters dead, with I think over 15,000 wounded. So this idea of endless wars is legitimate, and not having the appetite, why should we do it? We're not the policemen of the world, and this and that. But America, whether we like it or not, it is an economic power. It is a military power. And part of that responsibility and part of that power comes with American might and American presence in the region. Because whether we like it or not, if we take a step back, the bad guys are going to take advantage. If we take a step back, somebody's got to fill in that gap. And that will be Russia. Because we've seen that. As we're speaking right now, Russia and Erdogan are having a conversation about how to carve up Syria. They're carving up spheres of influence. So either the United States is going to be part of this conversation, or they're going to be isolated, and our credibility will be on the line as well. So this is not just about the Kurds. This is just about the larger credibility of the United States on the world stage.
Right, and I think from my perspective, what bothers me most about this is that it makes our word inconsistent at this point, and that's not good for anyone. So you could say we should not be involved in other people's wars, which I completely agree. However, now we're there, we can't just leave, act like nothing happened. You have to finish what you start. You have to be true to your word. Otherwise that starts the world operating in a way that no one wants it to operate.
Exactly. And inconsistency is very dangerous, especially in a place like the Middle East, because everybody is watching the United States, and everybody wants the United States to make the wrong move. Unfortunately, we haven't had a Syrian policy for even under the Obama administration. This is just a continuation. Everybody knows about the famous red line that President Obama drew, never followed through on it after Assad used chemical weapons. I believe it was in 2013. So, but this is a continuation of this policy that we lack, and it's largely because we don't want to, it's their war, it's not ours. If the United States wants to keep the economy of the world more stable, if the United States wants to have an influence in future conversations about technology, about military, about the economy, the United States has to be in the Middle East. Putting troops on the ground, it's not about regime change. And I think that was one of the conversations they were having during the Democratic debate. It's not about regime change. The United States never had a policy of regime change in Syria I believe, for years, 5 years now. We let that go a long time ago. We weren't there to topple the Assad regime. We were there to defeat the ISIS caliphate, and we were there to stabilize that region. But, and also 1,000 troops is not going to topple the Assad regime. I think, and we were way past that. And that's also part of that inconsistency that you spoke of, is that nobody knows what the U.S.'s role is on the ground because we don't have a coherent policy. It's not on paper. One person will say this, the next day somebody else will undermine the other official and say something else. And then at the meantime, our allies on the ground are just confused. They don't know what to do. And I think this incursion was another example of that inconsistency, that even military officials on the ground were shocked and surprised and disappointed as well. I thought we were past that. I thought we're going to keep troops here. We did gradually withdraw from December 2018 to about a week and a half ago to 1,000 troops, coming from 2,000 to 1,000. And then now we're going to take these couple hundred troops out, which is another inconsistency. To make matters even worse, at the same time of the invasion of Turkey, and at the same time of ending our so-called endless wars, taking U.S. military troops out of the Middle East, this administration puts in an additional 2,000 troops in Saudi Arabia. So that's inconsistency to me. I thought we're ending endless wars, right? I thought we went out of these regions. I thought this is not our fight. But how are we? Why? Because the Kurds don't have so much money? Is it because our lack of ties with the administration, something that Saudi Arabia has. And we have to understand that, the president likes to make this this argument that, which he did, is that, Saudi Arabia is paying for everything. Saudi Arabia is paying for the troops. Saudi Arabia is paying for their the strategies, everything on the ground. They're paying for it. It's taken care of. Number one, the problem with that is our soldiers, our U.S. soldiers, are not mercenaries. We don't do it for money. We do it because it's in our national security interest to be in the region. And number two, Kurds are our allies. Even if it wasn't the Kurds, somebody else, if we did that too, those are our allies. We can't simply betray our allies. We can't simply undermine U.S. presence on the ground and long-term strategy on the ground, because the Kurds were fighting Daesh before President Trump came, and most likely they'll be, the region will be dealing with these terrorists long after the president is gone. So his decision has a long-term effect.
Right. So let's talk about the average American now. So generally, what I've seen across partisan lines is frustration with this decision. There's not a huge amount of people who are, yes, screw the Kurds, glad we're out. I've generally seen concern. Now, if you have a bunch, if Kurdistan had American concern in 50 cents, you'd have 50 cents. But so how can that actually be made to be useful for the Kurds?
So one thing the president did for the Kurds that was actually good is for us to see if Americans know who the Kurds are, number one, and if they like us, to the simplest terms, if they support us, if they back us. The president not only united the extreme left and extreme right, and of course everybody else in the middle, he also united, the actual people, and not just his base, not just the political arena, but the American people decided that this was a wrong decision. The president messed up bad, and we should not betray our allies, who are the Kurds. And for us Kurds, we saw the passion and the regret and the shame. Many people were saying they were ashamed of the American people. We know this is not a decision of the American people. We know the American people are behind the Kurds and they support the Kurds fully. We know this is a decision of this administration and of this president. What we can take away from this support is if Americans are serious about backing our Kurdish partners on the ground, if the Americans are truly are sympathetic to the Kurdish plight and the Kurdish cause. Because as a Kurd, I can say that, I lived in a refugee camp for 7 years. We thought that was the end of it. Now they're fleeing again, and they continue to flee. They'll continue to flee. I think it's time for Americans and American officials, and whether it's this administration or the next administration, is to finally create a coherent foreign policy for the Kurds. We are lacking that. We need a policy between America and Kurdistan. And when I say Kurdistan, I mean all of Kurdistan, all 4 parts, and create a policy that is in the national security interests of the United States and the national security interests of the Kurds, because the Kurds can play a major role and can be a major ally and can be of major value to the United States on the ground, aside from Israel. And I think the Kurds share our American values, share our values of democracy, of empowering women, of empowering religious minorities, of protecting ethnic and religious minorities. And I think what we can take away from this is that we can build upon it. We can build a strong American Kurdish coalition. And just to say that this is not the wise move, because if we leave, we won't have any friends in the region anymore. We have to understand that, whether we like it or not, America is not very liked in the Arab world, even among our NATO ally, Turkey, and of course, Iran. You're left with Israel. I think, and Israel would appreciate the Kurds having a an entity of their own, a self-governing territory of their own, because long-term speaking, economically, militarily, it's in the interest of the United States, the Western nations, especially European Union, and also Israel.
Right. And I think probably part of what these conflicts show is that the Kurds do kind of form a natural nation, since that when everything else collapses, the Kurds seem to come out on top, because all the desire, all the infrastructure is there, so that Iraq and this Iraqi and Syrian governments are collapsing.
You know, if I may just add to that is, and that's the funny thing is, how hard we try American policy in the Middle East, we always ending up falling back on the Kurds. And I've made this argument so many times, is that look what happened in Iraq, right? It's 2003 Iraq war. We ended up backing the Kurds. The Shiite militia, the Shiite government of Maliki, we invested so much billions of dollars in Iraq. Nothing happened. Nothing came out of it. It was just the Shiite government central in Baghdad, which isolated the Sunni population in the country, and it was the Kurdish region that was peaceful. It was the Kurdish region that was pro-American. It was the Kurdish region that was pro-Christian, pro-Western ideas and values. Same thing in Syria. From since the 2011 civil war started, we invested billions of dollars in factions, the Free Syrian Army, FSA, and they were divided. They could not fight. They were very weak fighters. There were some of them were affiliated with Al-Qaeda members. They ended up dissolving. There are some factions left, but for the majority part, they ended up dissolving. Many of them went into different groups, Al-Qaeda groups and whatnot. And then we ended up falling back on the Kurds. So we're making all these, U-turns and go in all different directions. We end up falling back on the Kurds. That's why it's wise for the United States to create a policy for the Kurds outside of the scope of the status quo, which is Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, but strictly and independently straight for the Kurds, to avoid these. It's a waste of time. One, it's a waste of money, taxpayers' money. It's a waste of lives, risking American soldiers. When you can go straight to the successful, what that will be successful, that has a successful track record, and that happens to be the Kurds. And I think it'll be the same story if not now, later, if something happens in Iran. If we talk about regime change or whatnot, the Kurds are the most organized force in Iran as well. There's 12 million Kurds who call for self-determination, and they are the ones that Americans will end up relying on. It's just the way it is. So I think America has to go outside of this lens of, seeing the Middle East for what it used to be, but seeing it for what it is that these borders are unnatural. These central governments are very weak, and we're only empowering, unfortunately, these, the Irans of the region that continue to expand, or like the Turkeys of the region that continue to feel betrayed because of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. But if we empower local minorities, and the Kurds happen to be in the millions that are pro-American, pro-Western values and pro-Israel, I think the United States will have a much successful track record in the future.
The painful irony of all of this is really the borders people are so adamantly defending are borders that are just imposed by the European powers after the First World War.
Exactly.
They're not natural borders.
Just look at the map. It's straight lines. That's how it's failed, and it's wrong.
Yeah, Winston Churchill just draws a line around his car keys.
Two guys, British and a French guy, Sykes-Picot, came up with an agreement. Let's split these guys up. And the Kurds got the short end of that stick. And we see the faults of all this even to today, and until this is addressed. So
I think this is something that's really become an important topic to me over the last few years, because I would have viewed the world very pragmatically, but I really started applying my faith to politics, and there's this really interesting concept in the Bible of how the Bible speaks about nation states, and the kingdom of God in the Bible is not a kingdom that is an empire that rules over with governments and force, but it's a kingdom of hearts and minds. And what the Old Testament says, it destroys all the kingdoms of the world and blesses all the nations of the world.
Right.
So nations are a good thing in the eyes of the Bible because they keep tyrannical powers out of the lives of ordinary people, or they have the power to do that. And now it's easy to use that to make an idol out of a nation, and that's a bad thing. But the Bible also says in Acts 17 that nations rise given by God for allotted times and periods according to the boundaries that he's fixed. So I think we as Christians, it's important that we're paying attention to the idea of nations, that if people want to govern themselves, we should take that really, really seriously and be committed to self-determination, even when it's politically inconvenient to do so.
No, definitely agree, and especially Christians, and especially in this region, the Christian minorities of the region. I mean, take a look at Iraq. From prior to the 2003 Iraq War up until to today, there was I believe about 1.2 million Christians in Iraq. Today, there's about 250,000, maybe, give or take. Syria, same thing. Prior to the 2011 civil war, up until today, there was 200,000, 250. Now there's about half that. So the Christian, they've been suffering a lot in Egypt as well and other countries. But the Christian minorities, it's in their interest to, because they're minorities within, and they happen to be minorities within larger minorities. It's in their interest to align themselves with people that see eye to eye. I mean, because, unfortunately, and that happens to be the Kurds, by the way. The Kurds have protected converts. The Kurds have protected Muslims who have converted to Christianity. And that happened in northeast Syria. The Kurds have protected churches and holy sites. They lifted up crosses. And I think this is for the interest of Christian minorities and for the interest of other religious minorities. I mean, look at the Syriac language. The Syriac language has been banned in Syria. That's Jesus' old language, Aramaic. It's been banned in Syria for 2,000 years, I believe. It was finally recognized as an official language in 2015, when the Northeast Syria came about. So it was, in the Kurdish language, it was banned as well. It was not identified as legitimate, and it was recognized along with Arabic. So now for the empowerment of Christians in the region, for the empowerment of the religious minorities in the region, including Armenians and Yazidis as well, who were slaughtered by ISIS, it's in their interest to align with other minorities and create a strong coalition, because these central states, unfortunately, they don't have the interest of these minorities. They're dominated by a certain religion, or they're dominated by a certain ideology. And just like Iraq is 60% Shia. It's isolated its own Muslim Sunni minority. How are Christians and Yazidis and Kurds not going to be isolated, right?
Right. So to wrap this up, I want to have you do two things. I want you to if you could give a message to any Kurds in any region listening to this on the way forward, what would that be? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is going to be, if you have a message to people who outside, Western powers, Christians listening, other Muslims listening. So right. Kurds first, everyone else second.
Yeah, definitely. So Kurds, and as a Kurd, I speak to my fellow Kurds, is to say that America has not betrayed you. I I grew up in America, and I know the values of Americans. This is a decision by this administration only, that Americans are not with this betrayal. Americans still continue to support the Kurds. Americans continue to acknowledge the Kurds and the Kurdish aspirations. And I encourage Kurds to appreciate the historical relationship between America and Kurdistan, and Americans and Kurds. And I think this is very strong, and it continues to be strong. We know that U.S. soldiers were not at fault on the ground. They were simply taking orders from their commander-in-chief. And we saw that, for example, in Syria, as a U.S. soldier was leaving, he had a Kurdish patch on his arm. So this shows that the trust is still there between Americans and Kurds, and this is not over. And there will be other opportunities for America to rebuild this historical loss between us, and fill in that gap that we feel that, that what we call a betrayal by this administration. And my message to the outside of the Kurdistan region, outside of the Kurds and the Kurdish diaspora, is it's time for, it's time to realize that the Kurds, to prevent another problem like this, to prevent another conflict, to prevent another genocide, to prevent another mass humanitarian crisis, is to acknowledge that, one, Kurds exist, and to acknowledge that the only solution to this is self-determination. Is the only solution to this to protect Kurds from invading powers, from NATO's second largest military, like Turkey, to prevent threats from a Ba'athist regime like Assad, and an expanding Iranian regime, and a dominant Shiite government in Iraq, is to give Kurds their own state. And I encourage Americans, whether you're in America or in Europe, is to speak to your representatives, speak to your lawmakers, speak to your officials, that it's time to create a foreign policy for the Kurds in the interest of your home government and between the Kurdish nation.
Okay, thank you. Where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I'm very active on Twitter. My handle is @D_Abdulkader, ABDULKADER. So you can find me on there, and you can Google me. I often write on these issues as well.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for being on the show. If anyone listening disagrees with what you've said, I'd be happy to have a conversation about that as well. The idea here is to have a diverse range of ideas and let truth win ultimately, not to take any side but the side of truth, and to let ideas battle in the public sphere. So thank you.
This was wonderful. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you guys for listening to the Al Maida Initiative podcast. We'll be back next week.